Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. So delighted to have you here with me again today. It's just really exciting. And first off, I want to say greetings to all my new friends there in Medina, Ohio, with the Ohio Freedom Fighters. What a great crowd of folks that we met with on Wednesday night and had the honor to speak with in regards to the what? Yes, the lesser magistrates. What is that doctrine? What is it for our lesser magistrates, those elected, to be engaged properly, constitutionally, covenantally, and to be reminded that in Ohio, in particular, Article 1, Section 1 of the Ohio Constitution is what they must uphold. First and foremost are the rights of the citizens by taking what? By taking an oath of office, which brings them into the sovereignty of God as well as the judgment of God if they don't execute their oath of office and their office according to principles that are foundationally laid out right from the start. And we're going to talk about that. But again, thanks to all you folks there at Ohio Freedom Fighters in Medina. It was a delight to be with you. It was just a wonderful time and thoroughly enjoyed all that engagement that we had. So with that, let's talk about several other engagements. You know, there's so much that I always can tromp on down and through in each of these programs, but as you saw in the program promo, I did a lot on the play of the letter V, and that we've devalued our virtue in America, and it's ending, and it was crazy because I did put a P in there with putrid vomit. That pretty much sums up what's going on with the virtue in America. And we can see that all around us. We see that with following up on that question from the last couple constitutional classes. Can you legislate morality? And we talked about that somewhat last week as well. And it's critical to understand that it's happening. Whether it is being legislated or not, we're seeing that morality is shifting culturally because, well, you know what? I'm not even going to pull any punches. It's Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? And Sodom and Gomorrah came under judgment severely. And when that is allowed to happen, when a culture, it allows it to happen, when politically it's allowed to happen, and worse, when the pulpits have allowed it to happen. Just off to a note for a minute before I jump into some of the Anti-Federalists and Sam Adams that we're going to discuss today on that whole idea of our virtues. And I'm going to give you a twist on that. But let's just finish with this idea that the expectation, as we've heard over and over, is Madison and John Adams are the ones that are famously said to have made the statement that this Constitution, not the manipulated thing that we're dealing with at the moment, but the words, the original Constitution of 1787 was made only for a what? Virtuous and religious people, or some say virtuous and moral people. Well, you can't have morality without religion, and we touched bases on that last week. Some of the quotes from George Washington and others in the significance of religion in the operations of society. But right now, religion's under attack. If we take and we look at it, what we're seeing is that there's a young gal, I forget, what is she, fourth grade, third grade, fourth grade, whatever. She wore a muzzle to school that said, Jesus loves me. And she was reprimanded, told to leave, get rid of it, change it out, all of this type of stuff. But at the same time, the students and even the teachers can run around with BLM. They can run around with, 1619. They can run around with other obscenities or other things that, you know what? You don't necessarily have to have the legislators take and move the immorality into society, because we have allowed immorality to move into society without legislation. So in effect, when a culture starts going in that direction, soon to follow will be the legislation. And we're not going to get into how all that legislative effort comes into being, but a couple things that caught my attention relative to this was a letter by Sam Adams that he signed as Vindex in 1768. It's in your references right over my shoulder there at samueladamsreturns.net, where you can see all the references. If you're not getting the newsletter, please go to the website and sign up for the newsletter. So we're going to take a look at that, and that's kind of interesting relative to the military being called into Washington, D.C. As well on a peripheral, because we have militarized our federal law enforcement agencies, how the parallelisms that mirrors of history that we talk about on this program, how that is now reflecting from what happened when the troops were sent into Boston and quartered in people's homes. Now it's the hard knock on the door, and the stormtroopers enter and disrupt a home for all sorts of different reasons. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're not going to have time to go through the whole thing, so I highly recommend that you go ahead and look into the references on that article by Sam Adams. The other one that I really want to start with is by Philanthropos. Philanthropos was a Virginia Anti-Federalist, and this is an article there that was written. Thought it was very interesting and pertinent. Something else that, everybody out there is running around tossing out these manifestos. Well, in your references, I'm going to lead somewhere in the second or third segment with this idea of what Sam Adams wrote for the Manifesto of the Continental Congress, October 30, 1778. And I highly recommend that you read all of that when you get the opportunity. The most interesting one that I'm going to dig into, and this has that tie to where is our personal virtue, where's the virtue of the elected, where are we as a nation, and what are those meanings without using virtue at all in some of it. It was written by Richard Henry Lee as a pseudonym, the Federal Farmer, in January of 1788. So it's very interesting. We talked about before, we talked about in the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrate and in what I do, I talk about 100 years earlier when this letter was written in 1688, 1689 was the first revolution in America. And I mentioned that before when Governor Andros came into power. But in these last 5 minutes that I have here, let's just jump back over to Sam Adams real quick and talk about Washington, D.C., and that it is very improbable supposition that any people can long remain free with a strong military power in the very heart of their country, unless that military power is under the direction of the people, and even then that's dangerous. So history, both ancient and modern, go through and how states are overthrown, how the various practices of having that standing army available. And now we're seeing, and this is the relevant part, we're seeing the military under the Biden administration being turned into that social experiment, to the extent that here it becomes such an essential difference from the genius of a free people and the laws of a free government. Here, soldiers are used to obey the absolute commands of their superiors. It is death for them in the field to dispute their authority or to the rectitude of their orders. And sometimes they may be shot upon the spot without ceremony. So this was what was happening. And so even though, soldiers may say, no, we don't want to do this. No, we don't want to take the jab, or so on and so forth. But here it is now that these military there are occupying a city. They're occupying Boston. They're occupying Washington, D.C. But unlike this time of the Quartering Act, they're made to sleep in other locations, like what was that, in car parking areas and stuff like that. But it's dangerous to civil society when the military conceives of itself as an independent body, detached from the rest of society and subject to no control. Well, we have a lot of that that's going on, especially the way the Pentagon is being run under the Biden administration. It is almost becoming an entity on itself, and it has its limited bounds, but that Constitution, which admits of a power without a check, admits of a tyranny, and that people who are not always on their guard to make use of the remedy of the Constitution, when there is one, to restrain all kinds of power, and especially the military, from growing exorbitant, must blame themselves for the mischief that may befall them and the consequence of their inattention. So it's all on us. All this stuff, is on us, whether it's with the military occupation, whether it is the way that the federal agencies have been militarized. It's on us. And all the consequences are on us. Or if they do not reflect their own folly, their prosperity will surely curse them for entailing upon them the chains of slavery. So we're giving that right now, the chains of slavery, to our posterity. If, there's a lot of folks that are waking up. I know that if you're listening to this program, and especially if you're listening on Liberty Works Radio Network, that you are the choir. But you got to get beyond the choir. You have to get to that point of action, or you have to get beyond that point of being the audience. And that was the whole intent of talking about the lesser magistrates, is where do we, the people, become engaged, as Sam Adams talks about here, and how he challenged the whole idea of what was happening. We only have about a minute left, but I dare challenge them, that is, those in Britain and America, that any others to prove, and this is both sides of the aisle in America, a challenge by Sam Adams to prove that there was at least a necessity for those troops to go to D.C. for the professed purpose of their coming, namely to prevent or subdue rebels and traitors. Wow. Isn't that interesting? I will further venture to affirm that he must be either a knave or a fool if he has any tolerable acquaintance with the people of his town and province, nay, that he must be a traitor himself who asserts it. Sam Adams is saying that those that brought those troops in are the traitors, not we the people. So as we consider what the Anti-Federalists have to say, we'll pick up in the next segment a little bit more on Sam Adams, and then we'll jump into the rest of what we have because the Anti-Federalist got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They got it right. And all of you who are listening at Liberty Works Radio Network, gee, thank you so much that you have been looking for all those other hosts and hostesses. And more importantly, you've been looking for that donate button. This is, as I always say, a listener-funded network, and I appreciate the fact that you are willing to take the time not only to listen to this program, but to support the network as well. So go ahead, find those other hosts and hostesses. I'm delighted that you do. You know, they have great programming. But more importantly, please, as you find that time and the wherewithal, please donate to keep this network moving and doing well. So one of the things that I was looking at in relationship to everything that we have going on is that, you know, Sam was continuing this writing about the troops coming into Boston. So I see that no different as the militarization of the policing authorities, the different agencies, including why in the world, you know, do all of the parks people have to run around with guns? Why are IRS agents given guns? You know, why are those even in if you want to talk gun control, these people don't need that type of stuff. There's other policing authorities that they could utilize if they have real criminals that have tax problems or whatever. And the other idea is, why in the world does the Department of Education have a military/police force? It's bad enough that we mobilized, and notice, they mobilized for what? Washington, D.C., not the regular army, but they mobilized the militias. What used to be the militias, that was the National Guard, used to be the state militias. Now, I'm telling you, you just have to wonder on that. And Sam Adams said that those that, you know, came in and did all of that, they were what? They themselves are the traitors. They themselves are the traitors. So let me go back a minute, and what he says here is namely to prevent or subdue rebels and traitors. That's why they pulled him in. I will further venture to affirm that he, being those that called him in, those that support that, those that would be either Democrat or Republican in our modern time, he takes and he says, you must be a knave or a fool if those people has any tolerable acquaintance with the people of your own town and providence, nay, that you must be a traitor yourself who asserts utilizing troops and the police forces to come after, really, we the people, the patriots. I know very well that the whole continent of America is charged by some designing men with treason and rebellion. Did you hear that? What are we hearing about January 6th? All of you, especially if you consider yourself a constitutional, foundational patriot or a Trump supporter, which the majority are kind of like one and the same. There's some that are, as everywhere, far off. But if you consider yourself an American patriot, a citizen, foundationally, constitutionally named, you're being charged by designing what? Men, and in our case, women, with treason and rebellion for vindicating their constitutional natural rights. When was this written? Go look at the references at samueladamsreturns.net. Get the reference on this. It's there for you. Now, so it's on, you're trying to stand up for your constitutional natural rights, and they're sending the troops in, or they're taking and surrounding Washington, D.C., the seat of government where you have a right to go. It's called a right to redress. Now, but I must tell these men on both sides of the aisle, or in this case, the Atlantic, that no other force but that of reason and sound argument on their part, of which we have hitherto seen but precious little, will prevail upon us to relinquish our righteous claim. And we have a righteous claim to constitutionalism. Military power is by no means calculated to convince the understanding of men. It may, in another part of the world, affright women and children, and perhaps some weak men out of their senses. We have a lot of weak men in America, but will never awe a sensible American tamely to surrender his liberty. All right, buck up, America. Buck up to what Sam Adams has to say and the rest of it as well. Go to the references, read this, and read the whole letter that he wrote that I think is critical. We're not going to get to the manifesto today because we're already almost halfway through this segment and the next segment. I really want to get into our other anti-federalists. But this one's real important as we look now at the Constitution as it was developed. And in 1787, Philanthropus, in what he was writing here, is, I think, is very timely as well. So listen closely and imagine with me that mirror of history and take these words from 1787 and close your eyes and bring them to the present. Bring them to today. The time in which the Constitution or government of a nation undergoes any particular change. So we had Obama saying he was going to change the government. We have the Biden administration saying they're changing and are changing the government, is always interesting and critical. Enemies are vigilant. Allies are in suspense. Friends hesitating between hope and fear. And all men are in eager expectation to see what such a change may produce. But the state of our affairs at present is of such moment as even to arouse the dead. Well, we know that the dead were aroused because they went out and voted in, the 2020 election. I mean, that's statistically and from the data is being proven, the dead were aroused because of the situation, because Trump could not win. Well, all right, let's go further. So the Constitution. Let me start that. A certain defender of the Constitution has stated that objections to it are more calculated to alarm the fears of the people than to answer any valuable end. We hear that all the time from the Obama administration, the left, the communists, and all of that. Oh, don't worry about all these changes. Everything's fine. And if you look and you object to any of it, guess what? You're just causing fear among the people. So this was the case, as it is not. Will any man in his sober sense say that the least infringement or appearance of infringement on our liberty, that liberty which has lately cost so much blood and treasure, together with anxious days and sleepless nights, ought not both to rouse our fears and awaken our jealousies? That's what's happening, folks. That's why we have seen over the last 10 plus years now, the great movements of the Tea Party, the likes of the Ohio freedom fighters, and on and on. And we need to see that rise again because we should be jealous. Jealous. As God is jealous about our salvation, we are supposed to be jealous about our liberty. The new Constitution in its present form is calculated to produce despotism, thraldom, confusion, and if the United States do swallow it, they will find it the worst impection I could devise would be, may they adopt it. Wow. What are we doing? And worse, we're swallowing socialism. Oh my goodness. Where are we at? Where are we at? So I could devise, would be, may they adopt it. For tyranny, where it has been chained, as for a few years past, under the Trump administration, is always more cursed and sticks its teeth in deeper than before. Were Colonel George Mason's objections obviated, the improvement would be very considerable, though even then not so complete as might be. The Congress, having power without control to borrow money on the credit of the United States, they're having power to appoint their own salaries, and they're being paid out of the Treasury of the United States, thereby, in some measures, rendering them independent of the individual states. They're being judges of qualification and election of their own members, by which means they can get men to suit any purpose. Together with Colonel Mason's wise and judicious objections and grievances, the very idea of which is enough to make every honest citizen exclaim in the language of Cato, "Oh, liberty! Oh, my country!" Our present Constitution, with a few additional powers, and he was referring to the Articles of Confederation, with a few additional powers to Congress, seems better calculated to preserve the rights and defend the liberties of our citizens than the one proposed, without proper amendments. So that's why we had to go into the amendment process. Let us therefore, for once, show our judgment and solidity by continuing it, and prove the opinions to be erroneous, that levity and fickleness are not only the foibles of our tempers, but the reigning principles of the states. There are men amongst us of such dissatisfied tempers that place them in heaven. So if you stuck them in heaven, they would find something to blame, and so restless and self-sufficient that they must entirely reforming the state. And it goes on. But I think you get the initial gist of it, and there's more to it. Again, go to your references as we look at that. But I think the key elements that he's talking about, that it was clear to see that, and we're going to talk about it in the third segment even more, is that the Constitution as it was written in 87, that many discerning men and women, that the woman that really was a great anti-federalist being, as I've talked about before, is Mercy Otis Warren, and clearly understood that designing men and women would take and have and bring into these faults and lay upon us what? Despotism, tyranny, slavery. They would take and go and tax us, raise money on credit to do whatever they well please. And they'd eventually fix elections so that they would always have their own in office. Whoa, 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 whoa. This was like, what, 1787, the same year, September 1787 is when the Constitution came out of convention and went to the Continental, to then the Congress that was seated, and this was December. After reading through the Constitution, people had a clear idea that, number one, if we didn't amend it, and because the amendments that Colonel Mason was suggesting did not go into play, we have all the problems, predictable problems. And that's why I always say the Anti-Federalists, they got it right. Sam Adams, as we heard, he even got it right, many years before the Constitution was established. And we're going to see some more on another anti-federalist as we come back into the third segment. Oh my, how predictive those anti-federalists have been. So all those that have read the Anti-Federalists, I'm wonderful. I'm glad you finally got there. Those that read the Federalist Papers, that's only one side of the story, okay? The Federalist Papers do give a lot on, okay, some of the constructive ideas that were there for the Constitution, but the Anti-Federalists and Sam Adams got it right because they were able to discern the potentials that we're living through today. Come on back in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, we got to hit the start button. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and final segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists Got It Right. And I want to welcome back my Screaming Eagle friends. And you know what? If you go back and listen to this podcast, all my Screaming Eagle friends there in Lima, Ohio with Soaring Eagle Radio, you will be screaming. If you go back and you go to the archives at samueladamsreturns.net and you take and you listen to that second segment, I mean, the first segment should, get your hair a little bit on fire. But if you want to be that soaring eagle, which everyone on this program that's listening to this should be the soaring eagle of action. And everything that you're hearing today should incite you to act as that free citizen and challenge all of the lesser magistrates to act according to their oath of office and to protect you according to not just the Bill of Rights at the federal. Get to know the Bill of Rights in your state constitution and take it out. Bring it to the legislature, bring it to your county commissioner, bring it to your township trustee, bring it to every elected person, your prosecutors, your county commissioners, your school boards. And you tell the school boards in particular, look, you swore an oath to the federal Constitution, fine. But you swore an oath to the state constitution. And for you in Ohio, it is explicit what our rights are in our state constitution. And everyone that raised their hand and took an oath to obey and defend our constitutions need to be held accountable, especially in those school boards and any bureaucrat, because they're not doing it. They're not. They're all oath breakers. They're oath breakers. So enough with that. Let's get on to here our third segment. And as we go through, this Anti-Federalist is Richard Henry Lee. And I am going to read portions of it. And we look at the virtue that these men have. And when I talk about that virtue, I opened the first segment is about taking and legislating morality, but morality coming in to what? Into governance in such a way that it becomes a cultural issue. And then we have businesses that have no virtue because they do not have the intestinal fortitude to stand on these next ideas that Richard Henry Lee in the Federal Farmer of January 1788. September of 1788 is when the Constitution was given over to Congress and sent then to the various states to be debated. Here we are, September, November, December, January, 3 months. And here's what Richard Henry Lee has to say, the Federal Farmer. He says, "It is said that our people have a high sense of freedom, possesses power, property, and the strong arm, meaning, I presume, that the body of the people can take care of themselves and awe their rulers. And therefore, particular provisions in the Constitution for their security may not be essential. When I come to examine these observations, they appear to me too trifling to lose to deserve a serious answer." You see, that was the real argument on why there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution of 1787. Well, you know what? People aren't going to take and let the federal government get all whacked out. They're not going to allow that tyranny. They can awe They're elected. They're politicians. They can get in their faces because you know why? Because they have a high sense of freedom. They possess the power of sovereign people. They own property. They are strong in arms. It means they have weapons capable of taking on an army. So remember that, all you anti-Second Amendment weenies out there, you uneducated communists that want to destroy and enslave the people. Richard Henry Lee is talking about this, and we have strong arms. And what that means is that our weapons during this period of time weren't just muskets. They were the most advanced military weapon of the day. And the citizens had them. They are their rulers. Therefore, particular provisions in the Constitution, for that security, because you have all of that, you people, you have all of that. Well, it's not essential in the Constitution. To palliate is a cool word. So I'm going to bring you to this definition of palliate just for a moment. So the second paragraph, palliate is make a disease or its symptoms seem less severe, unpleasant, without removing the cause, to disguise the seriousness or the gravity of an offense. Oh, to moderate the fears or suspicions around something. So to palliate for the smallness of the representation that was going on, and he's addressing the small number of representatives that are out there. So what representatives require virtue. We have to have a virtuous people. We have to have virtuous people that are elected to office. But he goes on to say here, you know what? The smallness of the representation is observed that the state governments in which the people are fully represented necessarily form a part of the system. So it was a clear understanding foundationally and argued within the context of even Madison's notes, and Yates has it to some effect, that when they were talking about the number of representatives that would be in Congress, the 1 to 30,000 was there because they think, okay, that's enough people at the federal level because we have the states who have the larger number of representations, and the states are part of the system in keeping a check. This idea ought to be fully examined. We ought to inquire if the convention have made the proper use of these essential parts. The state governments, then, we are told, will interpose between the arbitrary exercise of the power and the people, the power of the federal government. The state governments would get in there. And now, when the state governments try to get in there finally on the things like election and all of these other issues, these moral issues, the idea of abortion, the idea of the 1619 Project, the idea of critical race theory, the federal government and all its power and all that is there within the context of the Supreme Court say, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't interpose. Well, wait a minute. Richard Henry Lee says that's an assumed aspect of the foundation that the states would interpose and stand between the arbitrary exercise of power of the federal government and the people. True, they may, but armless and helpless, perhaps, with the privilege of making a noise when it hurts. Are you getting this, people? Are you looking in that mirrors of history? Are you sitting there with your eyes closed and hearing these words and seeing yourself right in the middle of this? Well, the states, they're armless. They don't have the arms to do it. They're helpless, perhaps. Oh, privilege. Oh, you can go make noise. You can say all you want. Yeah, you can, bring suits. You can legislate whatever you want, but we're going to just go over you, roll over you with the Supreme Court and legislation now that is going to be immoral and subsume everything in the states. This is no more than individuals may do. That's all you can do. Go make noise. Go make that phone call. Ring, 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 ring. Make a noise. Ring, 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 or whatever the sound like. Okay. Does the Constitution provide a single check for a single measure by which the state governments can constitutionally and regularly check the arbitrary measures of Congress? Congress may raise immediately 50,000 men and $20 million in taxes. Build it now, they're talking, $1 trillion, and, they can take and raise, call in the National Guard and all of that. Raise $1 trillion, put us into debt, $2 trillion for an infrastructure bill. Build a Navy, model the militia, and etc. And all this constitutionally. Congress may arm on every point. That means they can arm, what we're seeing, they can militarize every bureaucracy. Okay. Yep. And the state governments can do no more than an individual, by petition to Congress, suggest their measures are alarming and those measures are not right. Well, fortunately, we did see that when the amendments went into play, we did have, and we do have, the 10th Amendment. But you know what? You haven't done anything with that 10th Amendment in the last 200 years, so guess what? You're all full of baloney, go away. And we're the federal government. We have already assumed you're here, you're hooked. For those that are on the radio, what I just did was I put a big fish hook of my finger in my mouth. You're hooked because we're stealing the money of the citizens and we're doling it on back to you and your state with conditions that you will obey us, the federal government. I conceive the positions to be undeniable that the federal government will be principally in the hands of the natural aristocracy, and the state governments principally in the hands of the democracy, the representatives of the body of the people. These representatives, like in Great Britain, hold the purse and have a negative upon all laws. We must yield to circumstances and depart something from this plan and strike out a new medium so as to give efficacy to the whole system, supply the wants of the Union, and leave the several states or the people assembled in the state legislatures the means of defense. Is that happening? No, didn't happen then. Still doesn't happen. It has been often mentioned that the objects of Congress will be few and national and require a small representation, that the objects of each state will be many and local and require numerous representation. We've heard that over and over again. Madison said that, the others said that. He then goes into what are the allotted numbers. He even predicts how Congress will grow to a few hundred and represent gross numbers. So what we have now is in many states, we have one congressperson representing 900 to 1.4 million people. Okay. And is that proper representation? Well, I've done other programs on that. And what the actual First Amendment was in respect to what it meant to ensuring that we always had proper representation in Congress. But the argument was, you don't need that many in there because you're going to have limited powers and everybody's going to adhere to that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now, what you need to do as we end today's program is go ahead, take the time, look at the references, and understand, as you well do, otherwise you wouldn't be listening to this program, is that the federal government's out of control. So the restoration project at hand is your state to gain back that power, to ensure that the state representatives and those in the various offices will be virtuous men who understand their oath of office and that they are under the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of you, the people, based on your state's Bill of Rights. So you know what? Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They got it right. Sam Adams saw this coming, and you should now act according to the truth. Come on back next week.